Day 4. The sun had just started to come up and Jake and Steve had survived the night without further incident. Jake wanted to get a fire started in the old wood cook stove so he could make some coffee. They ran out of the kitchen matches they used to light the lanterns. Jake remembered he left his cigarettes and lighter on the front porch, but wasn't too keen on the idea of going out there to retrieve the lighter to get the fire started in the stove. Jake said, "Cover for me with the flashlight from my bedroom window while I open the door and step out on the porch to get my cigarettes and lighter." Steve walked into the bedroom and looked out the window which faced the front yard. "Okay, I don't see anything out there," he shouted. Jake opened the front door cautiously. It opened inward so he was easily able to pick up the pieces of the broken table and camp stove and move them away from in front of the door. Steve continued to scan the front yard with the flashlight. He shouted through the closed window, "I still don't see anything." Jake quickly retrieved his cigarettes and lighter from the bench where he left them the night before. He went back into the house and closed and locked the door behind him. He quickly got the fire burning in the kitchen stove with wood from the old firewood box located next to it. He filled the percolator coffee pot with bottled water and coffee grounds and placed it on the stove. At about the time the pot started to perk, Steve appeared back in the kitchen. He had with him what appeared to be several long strands of dark, almost chocolate brown hairs. Jake asked, "Where did those come from?" Steve said, "I was making sure the chest of drawers in the bedroom completely covered over the broken window opening so nothing could push the chest over again. The back of the chest will only press up against the window so far because the windowsill prevents it from flatly covering the window by about 2 inches. I shined the flashlight behind the chest and noticed the hairs hanging off the right side of the window sash." Jake said, "Obviously, the hairs must have come from the creature which pushed the chest over. Hand him to me so I can examine him more closely." "Wow. Do you smell the wild animal odor coming from them?" "They reek. They smell like the nests and barn and pig pen we discovered yesterday." While Jake continued to examine the hairs, Steve asked, "Isn't it getting a little smoky in here?" It dawned on Jake it had been so long since he used the wood cook stove he forgot to open the damper in the flue pipe. Before he could voice his thought, they were overtaken from all the smoke which poured from the stove. "Open the door so I can fan the smoke outside," Jake said. While Steve opened the door, Jake opened the damper and grabbed a dish towel to use as a makeshift fan to push the smoke toward the door. This scenario lasted for 2 minutes before they had to step onto the porch to get some fresh air. They coughed for a considerable amount of time before they could rid their lungs of the smoke. Once the smoke cleared, they went back into the house and settled at the kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee. Jake said, "At least we have physical proof these creatures exist," as he reached to the far end of the kitchen table and retrieved a baggie to put the hairs in for safekeeping. "Yeah. What's it gonna prove?" Steve asked. "It'll prove to the authorities what killed us if we don't make it out of here alive." Steve flipped Jake the bird. They agreed because of the events which took place last night. They should stay close to the house today. They decided neither of them should venture anywhere on the property alone, not even to the outhouse. At that point, after they talked things over, they assumed the creatures would get them if they walked the half-mile to the car. These assumptions were something neither of them wanted to continue to talk or think about. They busied themselves and opened the blinds and curtains and cleaned up the house. Jake put the lanterns out once a sufficient amount of light came through the windows. They occasionally took a break on the porch. Jake said, "I can't believe we're being hassled by a bigfoot. Not only a single one, but what looks like an entire family. We know for a fact there are at least 3 creatures roaming around here. The 2 which were knocking from each end of the property and the one which screamed from the mountainside last night." "Don't sound so thrilled about it." "We're pretty much trapped here," Steve said as he rolled his eyes and sighed. "Don't worry. Even though it seems like the neighbors on top of the mountain don't come down here very often, they do come down here occasionally to check up on the place. Don't forget about the 2 hillbillies which nearly ran us over the other day. We're not so far from civilization we won't encounter other people once in a while." They both needed to use the outhouse. They covered for each other during the process. Jake locked the front door to the house before they headed to the outhouse, so he had his keys in hand. "Remember, we need to get the boards from the barn to board up the broken window while we're out here," Jake said, after Steve finished his business and stepped back outside. Steve said. How could I forget? We're gonna have to make sure we seal the house up tight. On their way to the barn, Jake said, we'll find a hammer and nails inside the tool shed. What else could be in the tool shed we can use for a weapon? Steve asked. Jake said, I don't know. We'll have to look around when we get in there. Hopefully there'll be something else in there better than the axe and hatchet, Steve said. I don't think there'll be enough to stop one of the creatures. They made their way to the tool shed after they dropped the boards off outside the broken bedroom window. On their way there, Jake said, it might be a good idea to keep all the outbuildings locked so we'll not get any surprises if we need to get something from one of them. That's probably a good idea, Steve said. It'll be horrible to open the door and find a Bigfoot inside. That's the idea, Jake said. It's evident they like to take up residence in existing dwellings, like the cow stable and the pig pen. I couldn't imagine finding one sleeping in the spare bed in the wash house. Steve chuckled. That would be a sight to behold. I wonder if they prefer clean sheets and fluffed pillows. Maybe we can make a sign to hang on the doorknob of the wash house so they can let us know when they need room service. Jake chuckled. After they got the 5-gallon can of kerosene and the hammer and nails from the tool shed, they looked around for another makeshift weapon. There really wasn't anything else inside the tool shed any better than what they already had. Jake closed and locked the door. He stopped to double check and make sure. The doors were locked on either end of the coal house as well as the door to the wash house on their way back to board up the broken window. Jake stopped to drop the can of kerosene off on the porch on their way by. They made their way to the outside of the bedroom window and worked to board it up. The boards were longer than what they needed, so they nailed them to the window casing vertically. Doing this allowed the boards to completely cover the broken window from top to bottom. Jake said, take the hammer and nails back to the porch and sit them down. I'll put them back in the tool shed later. All right, I'll be on the porch. After Steve rounded the corner of the house, Jake walked over toward the barnyard gate and watered the fence post. While he stood there and took care of his business, he heard it would not come from quite a distance back in the woods on the other side of the barn. He hurried and finished his business and walked back to the house to join Steve on the front porch. Jake asked, did you hear the wood knock while he unlocked the front door? Steve said, no, I didn't hear it. It came from way up in the woods behind the barn, Jake said. They stepped inside the kitchen and Steve grabbed a soda from the cooler while Jake grabbed a bottle of water. They stepped back out to the porch and sat down and talked about an escape plan. Jake said, there's really nothing we can do to escape at this point in time. We really don't have any weapons other than the axe and hatchet. I don't think either weapon will do too much damage to something like a Bigfoot. I really don't want to get close enough to one of those things to hit it with the axe in the first place. We don't have any connection to the outside world because the phone's been shut off for nearly 3 years, just like the electricity. It ain't like it is at home where we can pick up the phone and call the police. Our only options are to try to make a break for it and make it to the car while we leave everything behind or wait for the neighbor to come and check up on things. I prefer the latter option because we'll probably get attacked and killed if we try to make a run to the car. I agree, Steve said as he nodded. Jake said, we'll get plenty of warning if one of the neighbors comes to check on things. We can hear their vehicle come down the mountain from a half-mile away, just like we heard the hillbillies come down the mountain the other day. We can make sure we're standing out in the middle of the road to flag them down well before they reach the bottom of the mountain. We can explain what's going on and either ask them to give us a ride close to where we can make it to the bridge or cover us with their guns or both. I agree, Steve said. That sounds like our only logical plan to escape. Because it approached 1 p.m., Jake asked, are you hungry? There's still a bunch of lunch meat and cheese, as well as fish fillets left in the cooler in the kitchen. Nah, I'll just wait and eat dinner. Yeah, I'm not really hungry myself. How can an animal figure out how to open the gate? Steve asked. Jake said, from what I recall, Bigfoot is related to the giant ape, chimpanzee, or some other hominid species which are thought to be highly intelligent. It wouldn't take much to figure out how to open the latch on the gate. Hell, it wouldn't take much to figure out how to turn a doorknob and open a door. Steve's eyes widened as he looked at the doorknob. No, it probably wouldn't take too much to figure out how to turn a doorknob. They continued to talk and Jake told Steve about a couple of incidents he had heard about while he grew up which could be related to these creatures. Both incidents happened several decades ago, Jake said. One involved my grandfather, and the other involved my aunt's father, who used to live near the country store up in the mountains in the next county, but not too far from here as the crow flies. Grandpa had told me he would go off and work at a lumberjack camp which was located several miles away for days on end while he left Grandma here at home by herself to tend to the farm animals and the garden. He said one time, after he had worked an exceptionally long job, he came home from work and took a shortcut through the woods. He said he had been away from home for several weeks, and at that point, he just wanted to get home quickly so he could rest and relax for a few days before he had to go back to work the following week. Grandpa had said he was still several miles away from home when he came upon a large laurel thicket which paralleled the trail he walked on. He said the thicket stretched out for a long way, and it was thick, meaning he couldn't see through it or over the top of it. After he had skirted the thicket for a little bit, he noticed the sound of something as it walked on the other side of it. He said he would take a few steps and stop. Then he said whatever was on the other side of the thicket would do the same thing. He could tell it was something on 2 feet because he was familiar with deer, bear, and other forest creatures, and because of that it scared him. He didn't think it was someone trying to play a trick on him because he was out in the middle of nowhere. Grandpa had said he walked on for several more minutes while he would occasionally stop to listen while he tried to figure out what stalked him on the other side of the thicket. Again, he would stop, and it would stop. He said he would take several steps and stop, and whatever stalked him would do the same. He said at one point he loudly sang the ABC song he and his fellow axemen would sing while they worked to scare whatever stalked him away. He said he sang, A is for the axes we all do know, and B is for the boys who use them so. C is for the chopping we've just now begun, while D is for the danger we're oftentimes in. Grandpa had said his loud singing didn't even deter whatever stalked him. He said he really became frightened at that point because he said his singing should have scared off any animal. He said he began to wonder if he was even dealing with an animal at that point. Grandpa had always carried his axe slung over his shoulder, and he stated he was to the point where he got really scared. He said he brought his axe off his shoulder to ready it as a weapon in case something leaped through the thicket at him. He said this went on for several more minutes until he finally reached the end of the thicket where he stopped to rest a few seconds. He said could hear something breathe heavily just on the other side of the thicket, but he still couldn't see it. Grandpa had said the trail opened into a grassy meadow, and he felt within his heart when he stepped out into the meadow whatever stalked him would attack him. He said he drew his axe over his head ready for battle and took off and ran. He said he ran as fast as his feet would carry him, and he made it all the way across to the other side of the meadow before he stopped to look back. He felt since whatever stalked him didn't give chase, he could stop to rest and catch his breath. He said when he looked back toward the thicket he saw a tall, dark, and hairy figure as it walked back in the direction from where it came. He said he never encountered anything like that before or since. He also said he never took that shortcut through the woods again. He said he never really liked to talk about it too much because it scared him so badly. Steve said that must have really been something because old mountain men really don't scare too easily. You're right, Jake said. Most of them are too afraid of getting ridiculed by their friends and neighbors if they say anything about what they've witnessed or encountered in the woods, and more often than not, they'll carry their secrets to their grave. Steve said, I need to take a leak, so hold off on the other story for a little while. All right, go ahead. I want to go in and get something else to drink anyway, Jake said as he stood up and went inside to get another bottle of water and another pack of cigarettes. He had just sat back down on the porch when Steve came back and sat down on the porch swing. Steve said, I'm ready. Go ahead and tell me the next story. Jake said, this story was told to me by my aunt. She spoke of a time when she was a girl about how she and her brothers and sister grew up back in the mountains in the next county over. She said she and her brothers and sister would roam all through the mountains without a care in the world. She said she had never encountered any monsters in the woods, but her father had when she was a girl. She said it was late one evening when after dinner her mother had asked her father to take out the garbage that her mother had collected throughout the day to the woods behind the house and dump it in an old garbage dump. This is what country people did back then and probably still do to this day. They don't have garbage collection like we do in the cities. The garbage dump, I'd imagine, is similar to the one in the woods here, behind the barn. Anyway, my aunt said her dad took the container of garbage out the back door and walked across the yard and into the tree line behind the house. She said he emptied the container and threw stuff toward the middle of the dump. After a few seconds of doing this, something big and hairy raised up on two legs on the other side of the dump and growled at her dad. She said she can remember her dad running back inside the house to grab his rifle and shout for her brothers to go with him to get the monster that was in the dump. My aunt said, like my grandpa, her dad was born and raised in the woods and wasn't scared of anything. She said she had never seen her father so scared in all of her life. Just like my grandpa, she said. Her dad kept saying it wasn't a bear because it ran off on two legs. My aunt said her father said the creature was well over 7 feet tall and extremely big. After several minutes, my aunt said her dad and brothers came back into the house and said they didn't see the creature again. They followed some large human-shaped footprints several yards back into the woods until they lost sight of them. This was when they decided to come back to the house because they couldn't figure out where the creature had gone from the location where they lost sight of the footprints. They assumed my aunt's dad had startled it when he threw the garbage in the dump. They figured it was probably in the dump looking for scraps of food or something. She said they had never encountered the creature again, but every time her dad went to the dump, he carried his rifle. That's scary, Steve said. Can you imagine being that close to one of these things? No, Jake said. I don't like to think how close I came to the one that broke through the bedroom window last night. I imagine if we didn't shout to scare the thing off, it might have tried to climb through the window, or at the very least, grab me and drag me out of the bed and back through the window if we hadn't moved the chest in front of it to begin with. You saw them. The arms were long and massive. I think it could have easily reached me through the window, being I was only about 6 feet away from it. Yeah, it probably could have, Steve said. Jake started to get hungry, so he looked at his watch to check the time. It neared 5 p.m., almost dinner time. He decided he could wait a while longer because he had another story to tell Steve about what his uncle, his aunt's husband he just spoke about, had told him that happened to him in Northeast Ohio. Jake said, "This happened within several miles of our homes just outside the city limits." "Do tell," Steve said as he rubbed his hands together. Jake said, "Well, the story is related to me by my uncle goes something like this. He and my aunt lived on State Route 82 at the upper end of Mosquito Lake. This is only maybe 10 miles outside Warren City limits. My uncle said a co-worker buddy of his had just rented or bought a house on several acres on the corner of State Route 88 and North Park Avenue extension. He said the property had a large pond on it which was stocked with several species of freshwater fish, and his buddy invited him to go fishing in the pond with him and his boys one night after they got settled into their new house. He took his buddy up on his offer. He said it was near the middle of summer and they decided they would fish well into the night. He said they were spread out around the pond on the side near the house. He said his buddy and his buddy's 2 boys joked around and laughed while they fished and just had a good time. He said as night approached they each lit a lantern and continued to fish. He said each of them had caught several fish and they had them on their own separate stringers in the water. He said the property on the other side of the pond was heavily wooded with a considerable amount of underbrush which made it difficult to see very far into the tree line. A game trail led through the wooded area to the pond. He said his buddy had seen several deer come and go via the trail on almost a daily basis. The deer would come to the pond to drink fairly often. As dusk set in, my uncle said they quieted down because they heard what they thought was a herd of deer coming down the game trail toward the pond. They continued to fish in silence for a few more minutes while they watched the trail opening and expected to see the deer appear at any moment. He said what crashed through the trail had surprised them all. He said they all saw it at the same time. He described it as a large, hairy biped waving its arms erratically over its head while it screamed at them as it burst out of the woods. He said it turned to its right and followed the edge of the pond and ran straight at them. He said he and his buddy's kids threw their fishing poles down and jumped up and ran to the house. He said the creature chased them all the way up and onto the back porch. He said they had just made it inside and closed and locked the door when the creature stepped onto the porch. He said his buddy ran upstairs to get his shotgun, but by the time he got it loaded and got back downstairs, the creature had already fled back into the woods. He said they were so scared they remained locked inside the house for the remainder of the night. He said they didn't venture back outside to retrieve their fishing gear until it got daylight the next morning. He said they stayed up and talked about the creature all night long. He also said as an ex-Vietnam War veteran, he didn't scare easily, but whatever that creature was scared him to death. He said the creature was at least 7.5 to 8 feet tall, covered in dark matted hair, and had to weigh at least several hundred pounds. He said the creature could have easily broken the door down and went inside the house if it wanted to. Well, Steve said, you know, that really ain't too far from where I live. Maybe only 5 miles or so. I know. I didn't realize these creatures are all over the United States. It seems the media portrays them as being gentle, and the majority of all sightings seem to happen in the Pacific Northwest. I would have never thought these creatures would be here in central West Virginia or Ohio for that matter. Why not? Steve asked and said, there's plenty of secluded areas where they can hide around here, not to mention in Ohio as well. If you stop and think about it, this area is devoid of any human activity for the better part of the year. If you really stop and think about it, these creatures probably seized the opportunity to move into the area after your grandparents passed away because there are no longer any full-time residents around. Yeah, that does make sense, Jake said. Steve said, my dad told me about an incident which happened when him and a couple of his buddies went camping. He said it happened to him when he was in his late teens. He was with his best friend Jim, and they borrowed my grandpa's car and picked up 2 of their high school buddies. They planned to camp at Lake Milton for a few days on their summer break before their senior year in high school. He told me they got to the campgrounds and got set up. He said him and Jim shared one tent while their other 2 buddies shared another one. He said they brought along some beer and cooked hot dogs over a campfire the first night and got drunk and went to bed. He said their first night was uneventful. They swam the next day and horsed around until they went back to their campsite for dinner. He said they drank more beer and made hamburgers. They sat around the campfire for a while and told ghost stories before they went to bed. My dad told me he had to get up in the middle of the night to piss. He unzipped the tent flaps and crawled out of the tent and grabbed the flashlight from off the picnic table and walked several yards down a path into the woods to do his business. He said he didn't turn the light on because he didn't need it. He said he stood next to a bush while he pissed and he heard something grunt a few feet to his left. He said he finished up and turned to his left and turned the flashlight on and shined it in the direction the grunt came from. He said there was a 9 feet tall hair-covered creature which stood there and stared at him. He said it could have easily reached out and grabbed him. That's how close he was to it. He said he turned and ran back to the tent and climbed back inside his sleeping bag and covered his head. He didn't say anything to any of his buddies or attempt to wake them up. He said he thought they wouldn't believe him. He laid there and listened and hoped the creature didn't come into their campsite. He said about 15 minutes. Later he heard heavy footsteps approach from the direction where he went and pissed. He said he heard it come into their camp and open and rifle through their cooler. He said a few minutes later he heard his other buddy in the other tent yell, "What the fuck's going on? Who's out there?" He said he heard his other buddy open the tent and crawl out of it. He said his other buddy must have seen the creature retreat back into the woods because he started yelling and woke the whole camp up. He said they all crawled out of their tents and his other buddy told them what he had seen. My dad said he told them what he had seen when he went to take a leak. He said his other buddy, which yelled, said something pushed its hand into the side of the tent. He said it woke him up when it pushed its hand into his thigh. Needless to say, they packed up all their stuff and left in the middle of the night. My dad said they had all made a pact to never talk about what they experienced for fear of being ridiculed at school. He said him and his buddies never said anything. He only told me and my mom and brother and sister about it. He said he never mentioned it to anyone else. He said the creature didn't seem aggressive. He said it seemed more curious than anything. Jake asked, "Did your dad ever go camping again?" Yeah, surprisingly. He took me and my mom camping several times when I was a kid. We camped at Mosquito Lake though. He didn't take us to Lake Milton. How old were you when he told you about the creature he saw? Maybe 14. I don't think he said anything before then because he used to take us camping a lot when I was growing up. I think if he would have said anything to me or my mom and sister before that, we never would have went camping with him again. Probably, Jake said. I'm getting hungry and I'm gonna go in the kitchen to get a fire started in the stove. I'm gonna warm up the leftover fish fillets and make some boxed macaroni and cheese for dinner. That sounds good. Before he headed into the house, Jake said, "Come with me to the woodpile so we can get some more firewood to replace what I used this morning when I made coffee." Within a few minutes, they were both in the kitchen and deposited their armloads of firewood into the wood box. Jake got the fire started in the stove and set the frying pan, which contained a fish on the back burner, to warm and a large pot of water on the front burner to boil. Steve put plates and forks at the table. "Do you think the creatures will be back tonight?" "Your guess is as good as mine," Jake said. "I hope not." After dinner, we can get the house ready. We can pull the blinds and close the curtains on all of the windows. We should make sure the lanterns are full of kerosene, so we won't have to stop and fill them if we need them. We shouldn't burn the lanterns all night like we did last night. We might be better off if we sleep in total darkness. Steve's eyes widened. I'd feel more comfortable if we would at least keep one lantern burning, because they're too hard to light in an emergency. Jake nodded. "Since we're out of matches, you'd have to use my lighter to light your lantern anyway. We can leave one lantern lit on the kitchen table." Steve said, "I'd feel more secure if we could nail the front door shut before we go to bed. I'll go around to the side of the house to where we boarded up the bedroom window and get one of the extra boards and nail it across the door before we go to bed." "Thank you," Steve said. "The stories you told me earlier have me a little spooked." They finished their dinner and retired to the front porch. They sat in silence for a while and listened to the sounds of nature, mainly the flow of the river because it drowned everything else out. While they sat there, Jake said, "I noticed the water seemed to be receding a little bit when we crossed the swinging bridge yesterday. That's a good thing. If it gets low enough, the neighbors on the top of the mountain will begin to cross it to get to town instead of driving 50 miles out of their way to get there from the other direction." Jake stood and flipped his cigarette, but way out into the yard. "I need to go back in the house to clean up the kitchen. Will you light the other lantern and bring it out here on the porch with you?" "Yeah, but I need to borrow your lighter to light it." "It's sitting on the bench next to my cigarettes," Jake said as he stepped into the house to retrieve the wash tub. He stepped back out to the pump to fill it with water and took it back into the house to wash and rinse the pots and pans. He and Steve continued to talk back and forth through the open front door while he finished doing the dishes and cleaning up the kitchen. When Jake finished, he joined Steve back on the porch and sat down to smoke another cigarette. Steve said, "I've never been somewhere where there's absolute darkness. I wish the security light worked." "I'm all too familiar with being here in the dark," Jake said. "That security light actually made it worse. It never let your eyes get fully adjusted to the darkness. I had to go use the outhouse after dark a few times when I was younger, and when you walk around the end of the house, you walk into total blackness. A blackness which doesn't allow you to see your hand just inches from your face. People kid about this, but that's because they've never experienced it for themselves. It's spooky beyond belief. You could be standing within inches to one of these creatures, and you wouldn't know it was there unless it made some kind of noise." Steve said, "If I lived here full time, I'd have stadium lights installed all over the property." Jake laughed. "Grab the lantern and follow me to the end of the house so I can get a board to nail across the inside of the front door." When they walked around the end of the house, they heard a creature scream again. This time the scream seemed to come from really far away, not like last night where they emanated from the hillside above the barnyard and house. Jake picked up one of the extra boards and they went back to the front porch. "It's still early," Jake said and asked, "Would you like to play a game of cards?" "Sure," Steve said. "What game do you want to play?" Jake said, "I don't know. Pick one." They stepped into the house and sat at the kitchen table and played several rounds of gin rummy. It got late and Jake asked, "Do you need to use the outhouse before we turn in for the night?" Steve said, "Yeah, I can go." "Grab the lantern and axe and I will go with you to stand guard while you do your business," Jake said. "I expect you to return the favor for me." "Nah," Steve said as he rolled his eyes. "I'll just let you sit there in the dark." Jake locked the kitchen door. "I know it seems silly to have to lock the house up just to use the facilities, but like I mentioned earlier, it's better than walking into a surprise upon our return. If these creatures can figure out how to unlatch the barnyard gate, I'm sure they can figure out how to turn a doorknob. You're right. It's better to be safe than sorry." They made it to the outhouse and back without incident. Jake unlocked the front door and they stepped inside. He picked up and held the board across the door while Steve drove several nails through it into the door jamb to secure it. Steve decided he was still hungry and made himself a sandwich and sat down at the table to eat it before he turned in. When he finished, he left the burning lantern sit on the kitchen table as he headed to the bedroom to get ready for bed. Jake was already in his bed but left his flashlight on so Steve could see to get undressed and get into his bed. Once Steve got settled, Jake turned out the flashlight and tried to go to sleep. He lay there for nearly an hour as he listened for any little noise which indicated the monster had returned. Jake suspected Steve did the same because he wasn't snoring. Because he didn't hear anything, Jake finally drifted off to sleep. Please tune in next week as we continue on with the next installment of A Journey Through Hell and Back. For those who cannot wait, this title is available on Amazon.com. A link to the book is available in the description below the video. Please remember to like and subscribe so you won't miss out on the continuing saga.